Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all fed and watered with delicious vegetarian food. Great to see you all. We have heard this morning from Policy Chairman Chris Hayward that nature is our greatest asset in the fight for climate change. And the momentum to integrate nature into financial and business decisions is the key. 2024 will see COP29 and COP16 take place weeks apart. And we are taking this opportunity to discuss what can be done and bring the two agendas together. I have esteemed panelists here and a virtual attendance first for today, which is wonderful. Before we start with questions, I would like to share some insights. I would like to bring three things to your attention today. One is some context around COP16. If we go back to December 2022 at COP15, nearly every country in the world committed to new global agreements to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030 and restore harmony with nature by 2050 through 4 goals and 23 targets. And COP16 this year will occur in Colombia, and it will be the first biodiversity COP since the adoption of the biodiversity plan. This is quite an important milestone because COP16 will focus on, 1, biodiversity loss caused by human activities, such as deforestation, pollution, and also, secondly, it will look into the implementation of the biodiversity plan through discussion of financial resources, upskilling, capacity building, technical and scientific cooperation, and also access to technology. Colombian Minister of Environment and Sustainable Development, Susana Mohamed, announced the theme of COP16 being peace with nature. And the aim of this COP16 is to be inclusive and elevate local and indigenous people's knowledge. COP16 presents a great opportunity for us to rethink, build, and accelerate the transition around new economic areas and also new models around biodiversity and nature. The second thing I would like to bring to your attention is where do we stand in terms of the implementation? So there is a role for both governments and private sector, as we are trying to do here today. And governments will definitely review the progress made to date, but also they will align their national biodiversity strategies and action plans against or in line with the biodiversity plan goals. And governments will be working closely with the private sector across developing pathways and addressing these goals and targets through some challenges and also the finance gap that is announced as being $700 billion per year. One example of that is leading causes of biodiversity loss is the habitat loss. And agricultural production is seen as a key driver. So how can several targets of the biodiversity plan address this issue, for instance? That will be discussed in our panel as well. And lastly, with this panel, what are we trying to do today? Is actually trying to bring you some practical insights, explore strategies and investment opportunities to reach nature and biodiversity goals. But not only that, to make business case and investment case for nature so that you can all take away some of the discussion here. And there will be a Q&A, so please use the QR codes on your tables to get connected with Slido, send us your questions, and we will hopefully, Mariana with us enough time also to get her opinion on the Q&A session. So let's begin. I will take a seat, and hopefully everyone can still hear me. So I would like to start with you, Shaun, and let's talk about momentum for nature. Since COP28, there has been a lot of momentum and a lot of things being discussed. So what is your take on the uptick of around financing nature? What do we see about this? Positive financing, especially. But beyond that, how has the development of the frameworks, rules, and regulations, lots of four-letter acronyms that we spoke this morning, is helping or hindering the progress? And maybe you can talk us through a little bit about risks and opportunities come with it.
Sure. So a couple of questions to break down there. Firstly, in terms of the acceleration or uptick, I guess pre-COP, but also post-COP, we've definitely seen an acceleration in terms of nature-related financing. I guess the reference point to that largely was at the end of 2023, UNEP issued a State of Finance for Nature report, which indicated that between 2021 and 2022, they'd seen roughly an 11% increase in financing around nature-based solutions. To put that into perspective, there was an increase from about $154 billion to $200 billion of financing, which unfortunately is an uptick, an acceleration, but at the same time, that number needs to now triple by 2030 and then quadruple by 2050. So there's definitely been an uptick, but at the same time, I think a couple of other really important things have happened. The first of which is more science and more research around the impacts that nature will have on GDP and on the business models of our clients. Yeah. And that information, clearly we heard earlier from a World Economic Forum perspective, that could equate to about 50% of potential global GDP at risk as a result of the impacts that we are having on nature, which is a significant number. You saw Reid and on an earlier panel, and the GFI have also put out some very interesting analysis and reports in conjunction with Oxford and Reading, looking at the impacts of nature loss on the UK, and again, a very, very similar sentiment. So the implications of nature are increasing in terms of our awareness, but at the same time, we're also developing, I guess, the data and the models to be able to better, I guess, articulate the risks that exist within the value chains that our clients have, but more broadly around better understanding the risks so that we can also then look at that in the context of the potential returns. And I think as you'll hear from Marc later, there's also a number of projects that have happened globally that have laid the foundation to a scaling up of nature-based solutions. So there is definitely momentum and an uptick. I guess to your second question around how have global frameworks either started to accelerate or hinder this uptick, I can definitely say categorically that the advent of global regulatory frameworks, TNFD, and again, the four-letter acronym, so TNFD, CSRD, and the ISSB as, I guess, the major global regulators around the production of nature-related disclosures, I think has been a game changer in terms of the way I see our clients from an EY perspective starting to look at nature and the risks and opportunities associated with nature more broadly. Yeah. Now, I think the last thing I'll quickly say is that with the exception of CSRD, these are largely voluntary at the moment. And I think our expectation and the reality is that once we see some of these standards becoming mandatory, it's no secret that then that unlocks additional investment and budgets to then be able to better understand the impacts, better develop the tooling and methodologies, and therefore, develop a greater appreciation of both the risks and opportunities associated with nature.
Great start. Thank you. Mariana, I would like to come to you. If you are able to hear us, we are very keen to hear your reflections around COP16. So would love to hear a little bit about what do you expect to see in Colombia this year, and also how that will translate into the conversations during COP29. As we are trying to bridge the agendas, would be great to hear your opinion.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon for you. I think, most of the conversation will be on resource mobilization. That'll be part of where the focus will be by governments, but also by business. And I think part of the reason why we're here and why it's not just a conversation of governments is because there's a broad recognition of dependencies on nature, but also risks related to kind of nature loss. Clearly, there's also a big question around the role of IPLCs and how local communities are also involved in decision making, in rule setting. How we stop talking about benefit, when there's a lot of conversations about benefit sharing, but I think the question is who's sharing with who. So I think that's one of the central points that's being brought to the table, and how, in relation to that, the way that decisions are made and how we think about these things and how we think about finance in the context of local communities and IPLCs evolves. I think the other relevant issue will be the kind of national biodiversity strategies and action plans. That's the NBSAPs. That's how different countries are going to address their finance gap. So we will see a lot of conversations about different financial instruments that are seeking to accelerate finance and underperformance-based kind of modalities. So I think that'll be an interesting thing that we'll see at COP.
Great, thank you. So let's change tack a little bit, and I would like to bring in you, Marc. As a recovering scientist, you have now gone to the dark side on the investment front, and maybe you can tell us why this is now the time to invest in nature.
Thank you. Well, there is always the good time for investing in nature because it's our keystone asset. And remember, it's the key infrastructure regulating our planetary system, including our climate. So there is no net zero without nature. And therefore, also nature ultimately regulates and conditions our economic system. But I would like to give you 3 interconnected reasons why it's so urgent to scale up investments in nature. The first one is about the unprecedented physical risks that we are facing as a result of the combined effect of climate change and nature degradation. Global insured losses due to climate and nature risk in the last 5 years have doubled compared to the previous 5 years. This is a rather exponential increase. Obviously, there are sectors that are more sensitive to this combined effect of climate change and nature degradation, and the food systems is one of them. Latest scientific research estimates that food inflation will be increasing at almost 3% per year in the next 10 years as a result of climate change. I believe this is an underestimation because still we are not capturing the true cost, the true economic cost of climate change. But this year we saw a very good example of what these 2 combined risks can do in terms of disrupting value chains. And I will take one of the favorite topics of Grant. We all heard what happened with the prices in the cocoa industry. Cocoa prices increased this year by more than 240% as a result of nature degradation and climate change. 70% of the cocoa of the world comes from West Africa, especially Ghana and Ivory Coast. In those countries, cocoa farms in the form of monocultures have expanded for the last 5 decades at the expense of more than 2.5 million hectares of natural forest and other natural ecosystems, so resulting in highly degraded landscapes where cocoa is produced. So landscapes that have a very low resistance and resilience to climate shocks, which in turn are becoming more frequent and more intense. And this is what happened this year, when you saw a wet season characterized by heavy rainfall followed by the spread of fungi. Then we had a dry season full of heat waves followed by viruses. So there was a collapse of the global production of cocoa. It's the 4th year in a row, so there is a great deficit. But this is going to be the new normal in many parts of the world, in many food commodities. So we need to be able to adapt to this new normal. And nature-based solutions are the only scalable solutions that we have to restore nature and create this landscape resilience. So that is the first reason. The second reason, which is very much connected to that, is that in the food and agriculture sector, you have 90% of the greenhouse emissions connected to the on-farm activities, land use change activities. So offsetting approaches are not good to reverse the situation. So you need within value chain mitigation strategies. And again, the most cost-effective approach we have is investing in nature-based solutions, restoring nature and transforming such an extractive monocultures into, for example, agroforestry systems, where instead of emitting carbon due to the intense use of fertilizers and pesticides, you will be using plants and trees to fertilize your soils and absorbing carbon at the same time. So mitigation is the second reason. No net zero without nature. And the third one, Shaun has been addressing it. It is the increasing business maturity around nature-based solutions. There is a clear demand pool coming from the legislation and the voluntary frameworks that are emerging, Shaun already mentioned, but there is also a supply push by more than 20 years of experience on the ground by scientific projects, philanthropic projects that have tested, provide us with the proof of concept. And in addition, we have also the technologies nowadays to quantify the benefits of nature-based solutions. So you can make nature-based solutions more liquid in terms of finance. So I would summarize with this through.
Very good. Really, really good summary as well. And perfect segue into bringing Grant in.
The chocolate.
I think this is the investment angle. What about the corporate angle? So what do you see corporates are bringing into their business practices, and where are the opportunities for them?
Yeah, great question. So you're probably wondering, why am I getting asked that question as chair of the SMI Ag Taskforce? So that's one hat I wear there, and obviously the terra carta and driving sustainable value in agriculture is critical to the future, and a great initiative set up by His Majesty the King. Before, or actually during that, also the ex-CEO of Mars. Now most of you, as you'll think about Mars as Mars bars, Galaxy, but we actually have Pedigree Pet Foods, Whiskers, Royal Canin, so a very big company. So why would the CEO of Mars be interested in climate change and what's happening with soil, as you rightly point out? So it's not just cocoa. If you step back for a second, roughly half the world's habitable land is agriculture. There are millions and millions of people dependent on agriculture, and all of us in this room are dependent on the food system. And the food system produces a third of greenhouse gases. And I read this morning, we're heading towards 2.5 degrees and not 1.5 degrees. So what's the role of private enterprise? So Mars is, almost a $50 billion business. If I use present tense, I apologize, because I worked there for 35 years. I should use past tense, but bear with me. So when you think about Mars and its greenhouse gas emissions, as Marc rightly pointed out, we discovered actually about 80% of it. We're actually an agricultural company. We take agricultural products, not only cocoa, but soya, wheat, and other agricultural rice and other agricultural products. And that takes most of our greenhouse gas emissions. So it's really a strategic imperative, not just because of our business, but because this is a human crisis. The people at the very edge of this, in agriculture, are the ones that will suffer most. So it's a combination of sustainability in your supply chain. It's about really making sure that you're creating a business that's vibrant, but not just for Mars and others, but for the whole community. And that's why the SMI, I think, is a great example of bringing together private, public, and philanthropy, working together to solve this. No one company can do it on their own. This needs phenomenal teamwork, and that's the reason I'm excited to be here today to provide probably two perspectives.
Great. I think now it's the time maybe to go deeper, and for the benefit of everyone watching as well, let's work on that business case. Let's create some understanding of how the business case will apply. And the successful business case will have two angles to it. One is the case needs to convince the private sector and investors, and also it needs to convince the regulators as well. So maybe I'll ask each of you, and then I'll get back to Mariana again to bring that governmental view. So what is, Marc, in your opinion, do you see as the role of the finance industry to support nature and biodiversity goals?
Since I am a natural scientist, I would see the finance industry as a pollinator. What is a pollinator doing in nature? It basically circulates pollen so that flowers become fruits, so that nature fructifies, so that nature becomes fruitful. So I see the finance industry should be doing something similar, circulating pollen in the form of capital so that business can fructify, so that we can create value rather than extract value. But I can give you an example of what we are going to do in Lombard Odier, because this year we are launching our first nature strategy, which will be a real assets strategy. First of all, our principle is that we see investing in nature as the best strategy to transform our economy rather than to offset for its failure. So with our investments, we want to holistically transform landscapes and value chains because they go together. So our strategy, and we will start with coffee because it's the most important soft commodity globally. It is also a high impact commodity, resulting in deforestation, emissions, because the way we are producing coffee through monocultures, we use a lot of fertilizers and pesticides, and also because coffee is very sensitive to climate change, especially coffee Arabica. 50% of the coffee growing areas right now will not be suitable for coffee in the next 2 decades. So our strategy will have 4 main components. I will briefly mention each of them. First of all, we will be acquiring or leasing degraded, underperforming land assets, especially in the form of monocultures, in ecologically relevant landscapes. We will then deploy CapEx in the form of nature-based solutions to restore nature at the landscape level, making those landscapes resilient to climate change, but also transforming these degraded extractive monocultures that are a problem for climate change because they are emitting a lot of carbon. In the case of coffee, for every kilo of coffee we produce 20 kilos of CO2. So we shift these monocultures using nature, transform them into agroforestry systems, forest-like systems, which, by the way, are the natural environment for coffee plants. This is why they become more resilient when they live within a forest. So, and the third part will be partnering with local communities so that we can scale at the landscape level this approach, as well as partnering and investing in end-to-end coffee business. Because we want also to make as efficient and as vertically integrated as possible the value chains. There are far too many intermediaries in many of these value chains, cocoa, coffee, cotton. So there is no capital moving upstream. So we need to make them more efficient. And the fourth component is how do we create value out of this? Well, first of all, we will increase the free cash flows, better coffee, and greater amount of ecosystem services that we'll be monetizing through our coffee. Second, we will create value on the land because we are shifting a degraded asset, which can become a stranded asset in the future climate, into a nature-based asset, resilient to climate change and contributing to climate change mitigation. And third, we will be creating value through the end-to-end coffee business that we will be supporting to scale up through these green approaches. So this is how we are going to invest in nature in the next years.
Fantastic. There are already questions coming. Can we have some live, real-life examples? So thank you very much, and coffee is a wonderful example of that. I think now we're into nature degradation topic. Shaun, I would like to bring you in. Given your experience at EY, and I'm sure you have a lot of agri clients too, what do you see in terms of how financial institutions can address this and how they can be useful, supportful to the projects that Marc is alluding to?
Yeah, thank you. So Marc has some great examples there, and often from the EY side, when we look at the kind of financing behind this, we actually always look to where the wealth and asset managers are first. So I think Marc's very well articulated, I guess, the business case behind this. I think from a financial services perspective, if we look across our European base of clients, we work with a number of clients that have either financing or investments across the agricultural portfolios. And Marc gave some examples around soil degradation, and that's a major impact from a European perspective too. There's about 7.6% of land across Europe that is subject to soil degradation every single year. So we need to be able to turn that around. But going back to the examples that Marc used, I think there's a couple of things. One is how do we start to measure those positive impacts and start to talk a common language when we're talking about return, not just from a profit or return on investment perspective, and we heard this earlier. How do we balance that a little bit more with meaningful metrics from a return perspective? But also, as we go into this, there is a lot of talk about nature positive and nature negative. And actually, those are very loosely defined terms. So although there are lots of frameworks out there that we spoke about earlier, Irem, that start to give broader disclosures, actually being really, really clear on what do we mean by nature positive, how does that then translate into the examples Marc gave around, I guess, changing the narrative away from just return on investment or profit and loss? How do we bake some of that in? I think you need a combination of those to start to really activate on the finance side. In terms of examples, I think there are some really good examples. There's one UK headquartered bank that's invested a lot of time with the Soil Association. They have a very big lending portfolio, and really working with them to better understand, I guess, composition, elements of soil, KPIs that the Soil Association has to then better inform, I guess, the way they approach that agricultural lending and crop yields. There are some really good examples of ecosystems developing within the UK banking sector around collaboration. I guess in addition to that, we heard from Richard from Barclays earlier, but a number of the big banks, including HSBC and Barclays, have now generated funds that have a specific focus, I guess, on developing the agricultural side of things. So it is starting. I think we need more level setting and clarity on metrics, but it's definitely the opportunities there.
Indeed. And that brings me back to you, Grant, because there is clear understanding the finance sector would like to support, and the lack of maybe understanding of measurement, metrics, frameworks, etc., puts corporates in a challenging situation. So how do you see the understanding is evolving within corporates, and how are they changing their business model based on this understanding?
Yeah, so I agree with everything that you both just said. I think it's exactly right. So it comes really in three waves, I would say. So Mars, wave one, we do it ourselves. We go out and we work in the cocoa fields, do cocoa for generations. We replant, we set up communities, we put money into those communities, we show hybridization. That's a typical wave one. Wave two is when you partner with one or two others. And so as part of the SMI, McCain, and working with McDonald's to do things together to bring the consumer. And I think the key part, the really tricky bit is what I'd say wave three, which is cross-industry collaboration. So if you get an opportunity to go to the SMI website, you'll see two reports that we've done over the last couple of years. One is what are the barriers to regenerative agriculture? Because it's pretty well known what to do, less tilling, more cover crops, etc. But still, it's only 9% in place, right? And we need it to be 3, 4, 5 times that. And that's where we discovered really there are tools there, but they're very dissipated. There are no one set of metrics. And we really need to give, the farmer wants to do the right thing. The farmer are business people who love the soil. But if you look at the soil around the world, it's getting depleted, there's less nutrients, there's more water runoff, which means you need to put in more chemicals. It's in an extractive, negative cycle. And what we need to do is break that cycle by bringing together all the players. And I think that's where each of the individual companies is trying to do the right thing, but it's the power of private and public working together that really makes the difference. And so, the SMI, for example, has got about 300 companies now. Even the Ag Taskforce was working in the value chain, but since that, we've brought in insurance companies, the bank you just mentioned, and other banks working together to try and break that. We need to break the cycle. We need a systemic change across the whole value chain, and you can only do that using multiple players. People want to invest. There are many investment managers out there who have come to me and said, I would love to invest in agriculture, but we need to know how that first loss is covered, we need to know how to measure it, and we need to give the farmers an additional value stream to do it. So it's all there, but it needs tremendous collaboration to make it happen. There's no doubt that the global supply chain is broken, and it's going to take phenomenal, uncommon collaboration to change that trajectory.
And maybe, Irem, just to add to that, I mean, I was having a conversation earlier. The other thing we shouldn't lose sight of is that we've got loads of great examples that have kind of gone before us. We've seen this through climate, both from a physical and transition risk perspective. We've seen the discussions around both transition and sustainable finance frameworks. There is a lot out there already. So that should lead us to a foundation where we can then kind of build on the lessons that we've learned through that to then really also accelerate to Grant and Marc's points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So great segue into Mariana, because I want to talk about the collaboration aspect of it and how private sector at COP16 can really amplify this. Actually, Mariana, there's a question for you on the Slido as well. How is Terrasos working with the international stakeholders in terms of looking into COPs in Colombia and this one and the next one in Brazil? So how do you really see this support community collaboration happening?
Okay. Well, maybe to answer that question, a little bit of background in terms of what we've been working on. So for us, kind of the main challenge that we've been addressing is the creation of business models that support biodiversity, and making sure that when private sector money goes into biodiversity conservation, it's actually impactful, not just in a ecological way, but also, that it delivers the financial and the permanence outcomes that we're looking for. And in that sense, Terrasos has pioneered habitat banks in Colombia and in Latin America. And we've also been at the forefront of the conversations related to biodiversity markets, pay for success, and biodiversity credit instruments. And I think, what really comes and what's really important for all of these things is that in the case of nature, in the case of biodiversity, the private sector cannot do it alone without public sector engagement, because at the end of the day, we're all trying to solve a policy problem. And so that collaboration of understanding what the policy enabling conditions are for these types of opportunities is really important. And with that in mind, I think one of the key elements that needs to be and that probably will be promoted in COP is the idea and the concept that we all need stronger biodiversity compensation law. And what is striking is that around the world, when we talk about tropical belt countries, only a handful have biodiversity compensation laws that work under a like-for-like and proximity requirement. And that's really key. That's the minimum. If we can't get development projects, infrastructure projects, energy projects to make sure that they're compensating their impacts appropriately, talking about nature positive is really an illusion. And in order to do that, we need to work with policymakers. And then once we work with policymakers, we can then create business opportunities such as habitat banks, such as pay for success contracting, which is where the private sector can play a huge role. Colombia is the leader in Latin America in terms of policy on this end, and we're seeing the private investment come in. We're seeing the deals and the transactions come in. And then in terms of our role in the international arena, it's really been about bringing, what we've been able to learn at a transaction level, at a policy engagement level, and see how we can leverage those lessons learned and create a momentum for biodiversity markets, whether it's compliance markets or voluntary markets. And that's why we have a strong agenda with MDBs. And we're working on, several flagship transactions that we're hoping, will be announced in COP.
Wonderful. Great work. And Mariana, thank you for making time. I know you may have to drop a little bit earlier, so thanks for all the insights you've given us today. I actually spotted a couple of good questions on the Slido and would like to direct one to you, Marc, if that's okay. How do we avoid the danger of using incorrect baselines to assess robust functioning ecosystems in investment decision making?
I think nature is complex, but using science does not make it complicated. So I think, we need to use science-based approaches, and there is plenty of science. It was mentioned by Shaun, by me. We have the right technology now to quantify that. So I think if we want to do it, there is no problem in terms of technology or knowledge to do that. So I don't see a barrier in doing that.
I mean, just to add to that, I think, on the climate side, especially when it comes to GHG emissions, you've had the advent of PCAF, the Partnership for Carbon Accounting frameworks, out there for a number of years. I think similarly, now you've got the advent of PBAF, which is the Partnership for Biodiversity Accounting framework. So I think to your point, Marc, that baseline will be there. It is coming. But again, we need better and more consistency around that is anchored into the science from the target perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think something that I would like to add, maybe I didn't emphasize it too much, is that I think we should see investing in nature not only as an offsetting strategy, which has been the mainstream in the last years. I think what we need to make the difference is not in this 20–30% of the land that we need to protect, obviously, is in the 80% of the land where we are producing our ecosystem services in the form of food, fibers. There is where we need to really invest in biodiversity and make it mainstream. That's really crucial.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think I can connect this with a question here. Great that we've given a lot of examples of positive financing. Is there too much focus on measurement plus reporting and less on the positives of nature investment? Mike asked the question.
Well, look, I just spent 25 years of my life doing the technology science part, and I moved to the finance because I thought there is not enough investments, So
yeah.
I think, again, we produce so much science. I was doing my PhD in the year 2000, where we were estimating that the risk of wildfires was going to accelerate in the next 20 years in Europe, in Canada, in many places. So I think science is already really having pretty good estimates where the world is going. The challenge with climate change is not what we know, but what we don't know, which is more scary, Mm-hmm. But I think we need to start investing, and also we will make mistakes, but we need to learn by doing. And to be honest, we are running out of time. I think the next 10 years are really crucial. We need to rethink our world if we want to rewrite our future on time. We have 10 years.
Yeah.
Maybe I could just build on that. So I think the metrics are critical. I'm a great believer you get what you measure, and let's not give up progress in the pursuit of perfection. We have to start somewhere, and so one of the things that we've really focused on the SMI Taskforce is trying to get to 5 or 6 simple measures to start us off, get the confidence built, and start making change. The time for talk is over. We need to get moving.
Interesting question came up based on the get moving. How impactful is the UK biodiversity net gain regulation, and can it be implemented globally?
I'll pass that to my friends.
I think it's a quite new legislation, so I think we need to wait a few years to see how impactful it is. But I think it's a very good regulation. It was a very good idea, to start connecting the dots between developing infrastructure and the economy, but protecting the biodiversity within, the locations where activities are taking place. But I think we will need to wait for some time to see the true impacts.
And also on the transition finance panel, it was mentioned that there are already great examples around the world that we can get some examples from other countries and edit and adopt our own policies. So it's all an evolving process, as many of you are aware. I would like to actually ask a closing question, but to all of you, in the sense that we had a great discussion here. I would like our audience to take away one thing from each of you in order to support the inclusion of nature and biodiversity discussions into the business. What is that one thing?
I mean, from my perspective, it's forums like today, right? It's the listening, it's the sharing, it's the collaboration. I mean, even over the course of the last 40-ish minutes, we've heard some really great examples from Marc in terms of, where are there real opportunities from a nature perspective in terms of regeneration opportunities. We heard from Mariana around some of the business models that are being produced to support nature-based investing. And so from that and from some of the risks and opportunities we spoke about from a framework perspective, there are more than enough examples, even in the 40 minutes that we've had today, for every individual in this room to go away and to start to think about just one of them and how they start to embed that within their own organizations and within their own business models. That's my one thing.
Great. Marc?
Yes, I have one message and then one request.
Okay.
If I may. So the message is, I mentioned it before, nature is our keystone asset. It's the assets that make possible all the other assets. It's also the true engine of our economy. I was telling to Shaun before the event, it is the most sophisticated technology in the planet. It's the result of billions of years of constant evolution. In nature, the only thing permanent is change. So the laboratory is working permanently, adapting to the new conditions. So we need to learn how to build an economy centered around nature. In the last 200 years, we have created a dichotomy between ecology and economy, which, by the way, two words that come from the same root, the Greek word oikos, which means home and environment. Economy means managing the environment, ecology, understanding your environment. So economy needs to follow ecology. We cannot manage what we don't understand. So we need to realize that the new economy that is coming in the 21st century should be based on nature. It's not separated from nature. And this is a mindset change. It will be challenging. Now the request, and since I am new to the finance industry, how it is that nature still is not an asset class? How it is?
This came up.
How it is that nature is not an asset class? I mean.
Great request. It was already brought up earlier today, and it's a great challenge that you're leaving us with. Grant, what is your one thing?
So first, I think the SMI, and you work closely with us, is across all of our groups, not just the Ag Task Force, is to do exactly that, is to make nature and agriculture an investable asset class. And to do that, there's a number of things have to be put in place. So for me, the one thing is, there's no one company, no one government is going to get this done. It really requires all of private, public, and philanthropy working together. So my request would be, join us in creating that movement, really build in the private sector, beyond what I'd call awareness and science and commitments to action. And to do that, you need your board, you need the CEO, and you need your management teams with an integrated value creation plan that sustainability isn't a side stream issue, it's a boardroom issue, and it doesn't change just when the CEO changes. I can tell you, when I retired or rewired, I like to call it, a year ago from Mars, Pool and Mars are still absolutely committed to that quest. So it's about change, and it's about metrics, and it's about measuring people. And what we did at Mars, we actually compensated our top 300 individuals just as much on greenhouse gas emissions as on financial results. That's a breakthrough, and we need that across thousands of companies, across multiple countries. So join us at the SMI and make a change.
Wonderful, that's great. And one last thing from me, I would say one thing that is all about is the capacity building. So none of us knew about these topics this much maybe before this panel. Now we know a lot more. So let's keep learning, keep being curious, and make sure nature and biodiversity are in our agenda. So thank you very much. Thanks for listening.